The Go-Between, one of my favourite ever novels. This is what I'm going to be talking about tonight. The Go-Between by L.P. Hartley, which is an all-time classic and a book that I recommend to my bibliotherapy clients very frequently. And I just wanted to tell people about it if they don't know about it already. And there might be some people joining tonight who have already read the book and would like to read it again. And I might persuade you why you might want to read it again. So I'm going to start by talking about L.P. Hartley himself, the author, before I get into the amazing brilliance of the actual novel. So L.P. Hartley was an author who actually wrote 17 novels, and this one is the one that he's most famous for, although he also wrote a trilogy called The Shrimp and the Anemone and Eustace and Hilda, and they were also incredibly famous within his lifetime. Hartley was educated at various schools, and he ended up going to Oxford, and he had a bit of a difficult childhood because he did lose his father quite young, and he did have some of the similar difficulties to those that are brought into Leo's life, who's in the story of the Go-Between. But he also had a bit of a weak heart, so he wasn't conscripted into the army when everyone else went off to the Second World War. He actually suffered a nervous breakdown in 1922 after he proposed to Joan Muse, and it's not known if she accepted him or not. And there is some question about his sexuality, about whether he was in fact gay, which does seem to be widely believed now, although he was never open about it. He actually spent a huge amount of his life in Venice because he fell in love with Venice, Italy, when he was in his 20s, and he travelled there with a very aristocratic gang, eventually buying a home next to the church of San Sebastiano, which is quite a wonderful and joyous concept. If only we could go to Venice now. He lived in Venice for much of his life, going back and forth. And apparently he used to hire his own gondolier and spend a lot of time going around the canals of Venice with his gondolier. And he also bought his own gondola. So he did pretty well for himself and had quite a great and exciting life. He was also incredibly sociable and used to entertain many guests, including the painter Henry Lamb, the art critic Adrian Stokes, and the novelist Leo Myers. So he did mix in quite exciting circles. He also hung out with the likes of Edith Wharton, Elizabeth Bowen, and Henry Green. But he famously, although he was part of the Bloomsbury set, he and Virginia Woolf apparently had a constantly rather negative relationship. He was very rude about her book, The Waves, and she never forgave him for that. And they obviously wrote in completely different styles because L.P. Hartley was a very realistic novelist, whereas Virginia Woolf wrote in her own unique style. Hartley was also known to be a hypochondriac, particularly afraid of tetanus and a painful death. Many believe that his fear of sickness came from his mother, who was known to be overly concerned about his health. And this does actually come up also in The Go-Between, in which young Leo, the hero of the book, is constantly slightly fretting about his health and being very understanding when the adults worry about him getting too hot or catching a chill. During Hartley's trips to Venice, he was frequently joined by David Cecil, leading many to believe that they were lovers, and it's not known, in fact, if that is the case. Hartley died in London at the age of 76 and was buried at Golders Green Crematorium. So He had a pretty good long life, spending a lot of time in Venice, and he did become successful in his own lifetime, particularly for The Go-Between, which was a highly appreciated book. And also, of course, it was made into the film in 1970 by Joseph Losey, which was an epic success. And many people know The Go-Between more from the film than they do from the book itself. So anyone that's seen the film and hasn't read the book, you've got to read the book, because it really is an amazingly brilliant and gripping read. It's probably one of my all-time favourite novels, and it's particularly great to read it in the summer because it is a hot summer sizzling read full of passion, deep dark thoughts, and it's a coming of age book which is ultimately tragic. But we'll move on to the book in a second. I just want to talk to you a little bit about the film as well, which was adapted. The screenplay was adapted by Harold Pinter. It starred Julie Christie, Alan Bates, Margaret Leighton, Michael Redgrave, and Dominic Guard, who played young Leo. It won the Palme d'Or at the 1971 Cannes Festival. And the very famous soundtrack was written by Michel Legrand. So it was an epically star-studded film, which captures all the intensity, the heat, and the passion of the book, which we're now going to delve into and to explain and describe quite why it has such an influence on so many people. And many people, famous writers and ordinary folk, cite it as being one of their favourite ever novels. Why is this? That's what we're going to be looking into this evening. Do say if you're joining me tonight and you have actually read the book. I'd love to know, because when I was posting about it online earlier on Twitter and so on, I got a lot of comments about how people love this book and how much they love going back to it. And Ali Smith wrote a really brilliant piece about it in The Guardian, which I will be quoting later, in which she talks about the joys of rereading the book. And I do think it's a particularly fantastic book to reread. And that's one of the things we're going to be delving into this evening. But I'm just going to read you the beginning of the book, which is incredibly famous for good reasons. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. When I came upon the diary, it was lying at the bottom of a rather battered red cardboard collar box, in which as a small boy I kept my Eton collars. Someone, probably my mother, had filled it with treasures dating from those days. There were 2 dry, empty sea urchins, 2 rusty magnets, a large one and a small one, which had almost lost their magnetism, some negatives rolled up in a tight coil, some stumps of sealing wax, a small combination lock with 3 rows of letters, a twist of very fine whipcord, and 1 or 2 ambiguous objects, pieces of things of which the use was not at once apparent. I could not even tell what they had belonged to. The relics were not exactly dirty, nor were they quite clean. They had the patina of age, and as I handled them for the first time for over 50 years, a recollection of what each had meant to me came back, faint as the magnet's power to draw, but as perceptible. Something came and went between us, the intimate pleasure of recognition, the almost mystical thrill of early ownership, feelings of which at 60-odd I felt ashamed. It was a roll call in reverse. The children of the past announced their names, and I said, "Here!" Only the diary refused to disclose its identity. My first impression was that it was a present someone had brought me from abroad. The shape, the lettering, the purple limp leather curling upwards at the corners gave it a foreign look, and it had, I could see, gold edges. Of all the exhibits, it was the only one that might have been expensive. I must have treasured it. Why then could I not have given it a context? I did not want to touch it and told myself that this was because it challenged my memory. I was proud of my memory and disliked having it prompted. So I sat staring at the diary, as at a blank space in a crossword puzzle. Still no light came, and suddenly I took the combination lock and began to finger it, for I remembered how at school I could always open it by the sense of touch when someone else had set the combination. It was one of my showpieces, and when I first mastered it, drew some applause, for I declared that to do it I had to put myself into a trance. And this was not quite a lie, for I did deliberately empty my mind and let my fingers work without direction. To heighten the effect, however, I would close my eyes and sway gently to and fro, until the effort of keeping my consciousness at a low ebb almost exhausted me. And this I found myself instinctively doing now, as to an audience. After a timeless interval, I heard the tiny click and felt the sides of the lock relax and draw apart. And at the same moment, as if by some sympathetic loosening in my mind, the secret of the diary flashed upon me. Yet, even then, I did not want to touch it. Indeed, my unwillingness increased, for now I knew why I distrusted it. I looked away, and it seemed to me that every object in the room exhaled the diary's enervating power and spoke its message of disappointment and defeat. And as if that was not enough, the voices reproached me with not having had the grit to overcome them. Under this twofold assault I sat, staring at the bulging envelopes around me, the stacks of papers tied up with red tape, the task of sorting which I'd set myself for winter evenings, and of which the red collar box had been almost the first item. And I felt, with a bitter blend of self-pity and self-reproach, that if it had not been for the diary, or what the diary stood for, everything could be different. I should not be sitting in this drab, flowerless room, where the curtains were not even drawn to hide the cold rain beating on the windows, or contemplating the accumulation of the past and the duty it imposed on me to sort it out. I should be sitting in another room, rainbow-hued, looking not into the past but into the future, and I should not be sitting alone. So I told myself, and with a gesture born of will, as most of my acts were, not inclination, I took the diary out of the box and opened it. Diary for the year 1900 is what it said. So I won't go on. It's a fantastic opening to the novel. Everything is in there, which is going to be later alluded to. I love the list of things that he finds in the rather battered red cardboard collar box, in which, as a small boy, he kept his Eton collars. There are the two dry, empty sea urchins, which speak of other books that L.P. Hartley wrote, because his trilogy, Eustace and Hilda, starts on the beach when they're collecting shells, and it also takes you back in a very nostalgic way to childhood and rock pooling. Two rusty magnets, a large one and a small one, which had both nearly lost their magnetism. So that's a pretty obvious metaphor for the magnetism of love, which is going to come into the book later when we hear about the doomed love, which is the heart of the book between Marion and Ted. And then there's a small combination lock with 3 rows of letters. So the combination lock is obviously also symbolizing marriage, a marriage that could or maybe didn't happen. I will save the spoilers for later, so I won't give everything away, and I'll give you a warning when I'm going to give the spoilers, because anyone that hasn't yet read this book, there are some very dramatic events which I don't want to give away, and I'll warn you when I come to a point that I could be giving it away. So Leo Coulston is the hero of the book. He's 12 and it's 1900, and he's at a boarding school where he's fairly popular. He's quite a successful character, but at the very beginning of the book, he kind of scuppers his life by writing in his diary that his team has vanquished another team in football, and he then gets mercilessly teased for his use of the word vanquished, and he decides, because of being teased so horribly, to set a spell on the boys that teased him. He sets a kind of curse because young Leo, with his zodiac diary, is a great believer in the stars, the powers of the zodiac, and he's pretty obsessed with what all the zodiac stars mean. He lives his life in his imagination, making himself akin with those stars in the sky and those characters referred to in the firmament. And so he sets this curse on the two boys that tormented him. And shockingly, his curse bears fruit because Jenkins and Strode, who are the boys that were being so foul to him, one day soon after he makes the curse, climb up on a roof and they fall off that roof and have they attain quite a lot of broken bones. So he now feels, young Leo, that he does indeed have the power in his hands, a kind of divine power to affect the people around him. He feels that he has people's destiny in his hands. And everyone at school also believes that he does have these powers. So he milks that ability. And this is something that we come back to later in the book because young Leo believes that he can still wield this power when he starts getting into deep water later on as events unfold, which we will come to shortly. So that sets the scene for you. Leo starts the book being an interesting young boy at school who has a very rich imagination, and that's very much contrasted with his current circumstances, which we saw at the very beginning of the book, the bit that I just read to you, where we realize that he's in his 60s, he's living alone, he's in a drab room, he's looking back into the past, he's not looking into the future, and he's ruining the day wishing that he was actually with someone, that he wasn't all alone. And we're going to discover during the course of the book in 1900 what it is that has made him become a stultified adult. And it really is such a tragic read. It does break my heart every time I read it. But every time you read it, you're rooting for Leo and hoping that he's actually going to overcome his difficulties. And there is indeed a glimmer of hope at the end, but we will come to that. So the beginning of the book, which I just read to you, was announced to L.P. Hartley when he was living in Venice in May 1952, working on a completely different project. But he dropped everything because he suddenly realised that this diary of a young boy in the year 1900 was what he had to write. And he then wrote it in a matter of mere months. He wrote the book in 5 months, which is always pretty impressive, I have to say, those people that write their books so quickly. And he wrote it in the heat of excitement. And indeed, it's an incredibly hot book where Leo obsessively watches the thermometer as it goes up to nearly 100. It's one of the hottest summers England's ever known. And Leo goes to stay at a country house in Norfolk. It's called Brandon Hall. And he goes to stay with his friend Marcus in Marcus's family seat. Now, Marcus is clearly from a rather rich family, which has the likes of Lord Trimingham among their friends. And Leo feels rather out of place because his mum and he live on their own. His father died. They live in a comparatively small house. And he is very much out of his depth. He arrives to go and stay at Brandon Hall wearing a boiling hot tweed suit because his mum has given him that suit. That's the only one she can afford. And as the temperatures rise, it's more and more embarrassing that he's wearing this hot, awful Norfolk jacket, which makes him a kind of clothing joke within the novel. And everyone else in the novel is wearing these rather spiffy, lovely linen white suits, and poor Leo is sweating away until Marcus's older sister Marion takes pity on him and goes and takes him into the town and buys him a rather gorgeous light green summer suit. And this is Marion winning his favours, because as we soon realise, she is grooming him, to use a modern word which L.P. Hartley would not have used, to become her go-between, because she wants Leo to take letters between herself and the groundsman who she is seeing on the side, to give that away. But that does get given away quite early on in the book, so it's not a terrible spoiler. So Marion becomes Leo's friend, but is she his friend really? I'm just going to read you a little bit about Marion from the book, which will give you a glimpse of what she's like. "My sister is very beautiful," Marcus said to me one day. He announced it quite impersonally, as who should say, 2 and 2 make 4, and I received it in the same spirit. It was a fact, like other facts, something to be learned. I had not thought of Miss Marion, I think I called her this to myself, as beautiful, but when I saw her next, I studied her in the light of Marcus's announcement. It must have been in the front part of the house, for I have an impression of light, which was absent in our part, Marcus's and mine. I believe I had some schoolboy notion that the front of the house, where the grown-up people lived, was the private side, and that I was trespassing when I went there. She must have been sitting still for my scrutiny, for I have the impression that I was looking down on her, and she was tall even by grown-up standards. I must have taken her unawares, for she was wearing what I afterwards came to think of as her hooded look. Her father's long eyelids drooped over her eyes, leaving under them a glint of blue so deep and liquid that it might have been shining through an unshed tear. Her hair was bright with sunshine, but her face, which was full like her mother's, only pale rose pink instead of cream, wore a stern, brooding look that her small curved nose made almost hawk-like. She looked formidable then, almost as formidable as her mother. A moment later she opened her eyes. I remember the sudden burst of blue, and her face lit up. So that is what it is to be beautiful, I thought, and for a time my idea of her as a person was confused and even eclipsed by the abstract idea of beauty that she represented. It didn't bring her nearer to me, rather the opposite, but I no longer confused her with the other young ladies who circled, planet-like, around the perimeter of my vision. It's very difficult to stop reading this book aloud because it's such a great book to read aloud. And I have to say, if you can grab someone this summer to read this book aloud with, I thoroughly recommend it. It's one of the best ever read aloud books that I've read with my husband. And it's because the language is so beautiful, it's so evocative, and every chapter does end on a cliffhanger. You wouldn't necessarily imagine it when you know that this book is set in a country house and it's all set on a very hot summer. There's cricket and tea parties. But when you realise the simmering danger that's lurking underneath this beautiful place where lovely people are floating around in their wonderful summer attire, you realise quite how gripping it is. So do, if you can, go out, find a copy of this book and find someone to read it aloud with over the next few weeks, because it's set in July 1900 and it's July now. What could be better than to read this hot summer read right now in July 2021? It's also a really great book to take you out of your current circumstances because it's taking you back 120 years and it's going back to a time before we had any of the current concerns that we have now. Of course, there were things lurking which were terrible at that time, but this particular summer described in the book takes you away from war. The only hint you have of war is Lord Trimingham, who is Marion's betrothed. So just to remind people about the characters, if you're just joining and if you haven't read it already, Leo is the young boy who narrates the story, and it's all told through the memories from his diary that he wrote in 1900. He goes to stay with his friend Marcus at Brandon Hall in Norfolk, and Marcus's older sister Marion is incredibly beautiful. Leo is smitten by her, and Marion is betrothed to Lord Trimingham. He, in young Leo's eyes, is a kind of two-headed Janus, because on one side of his face is very handsome, the other side of his face is completely disfigured and shot to pieces because he has been in the Boer War, and he is a lord. He's kind of quite a charming, lovely guy at the beginning of the book, but he's actually been very much battered and altered by his time in the war. He's played in the film by Michael Redgrave. And then there's the groundsman, Ted Burgess, who is played by Alan Bates. So do watch the film as well, but read the book first if you can. The film is brilliant, but the book is so much better. So that was a little glimpse of Marion in all her beauty. And what happens next to make the book roll on excitingly is that Marcus goes to bed with presumed measles, so he's taken out of the picture, and Leo is then left to his own devices. And Marion, very cleverly, having just been grooming him, as I told you earlier, to become her go-between between herself and Ted Burgess, she gets hold of him, and she very cleverly persuades him, making it seem that it's actually his idea to go and visit Ted and give him a letter that she's written. She tells him that she's writing to him on business matters, and poor innocent Leo has no idea and no inkling that these business letters are far from that, and he takes at least half of the book before he realizes what actually is going on with these letters. And when he does discover that Marion and Ted are actually in love, he's absolutely horrified and would never have guessed it. Because the past is a foreign country, I'm wearing one of my grandparents' attic outfits, which used to be in the attic in their home in Devon. And it does make me feel like I'm living in that past world, and it probably is from about 100 years ago. It's actually becoming quite hot, so I'm beginning to feel like I'm in the heat wave of the story. So that's Marion, and she's beautiful and very manipulative. And meanwhile, the other thing that goes on is that this whole wonderful book is set in incredibly evocative surroundings, because it's a beautiful, huge house within amazing, massive grounds of a wonderful garden. And in the garden, Leo goes exploring, and one of the things that he comes across is a deadly nightshade. And I'm just going to read you a bit about the deadly nightshade, because that becomes a big theme in the book. Enough of the vagaries and inconsistencies of my memory, but one thing which I had forgotten the diary did bring back, and not only the fact but the scene, with the utmost vividness. Wednesday the 11th of July saw the deadly nightshade, Atropa belladonna. Marcus wasn't with me. I was alone, exploring some derelict outhouses, which for me had obviously more attraction than the view of Brandon Hall from the southwest. In one which was a roofless as well as derelict, I suddenly came upon the plant, but it wasn't a plant in my sense of the word. It was a shrub, almost a tree, and as tall as I was. It looked the picture of evil, and also the picture of health. It was so glossy and strong and juicy looking. I could almost see the sap rising to nourish it. It seemed to have found the place in all the world that suited it best. I knew that every part of it was poisonous. I knew too that it was beautiful, for did not my mother's botany book say so? I stood on the threshold, not daring to go in, staring at the button-bright berries and the dull purplish, hairy, bell-shaped flowers reaching out towards me. I felt that the plant could poison me, even if I didn't touch it, and that if I didn't eat it, it would eat me. It looked so hungry in spite of all the nourishment it was getting. As if I'd been caught out looking at something I wasn't meant to see, I tiptoed away, wondering whether Mrs. Maudsley would think me interfering if I told her about it. But I didn't tell her. I couldn't bear to think of those lusty limbs withering on a rubbish heap or crackling in a fire, all that beauty being destroyed. Besides, I wanted to look at it again. Atropa, belladonna. So the belladonna is a huge symbol within the book. Leo is very much attracted to it while being horrified by it. And it does come back in the book in a very real way. It becomes part of Leo's attempt to wreak revenge on the adults that he realizes have done him harm. So this is a point for anyone to turn off and go and make a cup of tea, or go and have a nice cooling cocktail if you don't want to hear spoilers, because I'm now going to talk about what actually happens in the second half of the book. So if you haven't read the book yet or seen the film, now is the moment to go and do something else and then come back and watch the rest of it once you've read the book, and then you can tell me how you feel about the book. So Leo, having been working as a go-between, running back and forth between Marion and Ted Burgess, to cut out lots of detail, has suddenly had the realization that they're actually in love. Leo has been asking Ted, what does spooning mean? And Ted is doing his utmost not to tell Leo what spooning is. He keeps saying that spooning is something that Leo's father should tell him about, but of course Leo's father is dead, so he can't. And Leo says that he'll only carry on being the go-between between Ted and Marion if Ted tells him what spooning is. And Ted is then in an absolute rage and tells him to go away. Ted is a kind of working man, groundsman, farmer who doesn't mince his words. And Leo also makes the fatal mistake of opening one of the letters which go between the two lovers, and he sees what's revealed in that letter, the fact that they are passionately in love. And when he realizes that, he feels utterly let down. And he also understands that Marion all this time hasn't actually loved him, hasn't been appreciating him for his lovely young boyness. He's 12, but she's simply been using him as a messenger. And Leo initially enjoyed being a messenger. He liked being Mercury, the messenger of the gods. He saw himself as that godlike figure, Hermes, going back and forth across the sky. But once he realizes that Marion is just being mercenary about it, he understands that he's been completely manipulated, and he decides to get his own back. There's a lot more that happens in between, and he also does try and extract himself from the situation by writing to his mum and saying, please, I really want to come home, I don't like being a messenger. But he realizes that he can't actually give away what's really happening, because that would jeopardize terribly the adults. And even though he's really hurt and horrified, he realizes that that could actually have really dire consequences. So Leo decides that what he wants to do is to create a spell which will wreak havoc on these terrible adults. And I'm just going to try and read you the bit where he decides to use the belladonna to create that havoc. I'm just going to, before I do that, I'm just going to read you the bit where he describes how upset he is about realizing how he's been used. Not Adam and Eve, after eating the apple, could have been more upset than I was. I felt utterly deflated and let down. So deep did my disappointment and disillusion go that I lost all sense of where I was, and when I came to it, was like waking from a dream. They were in love! Marion and Ted Burgess were in love. Of all the possible explanations, it was the only one that had never crossed my mind. What a sell! What a frightful sell! And what a fool I'd been! Trying to regain my self-respect, I allowed myself a hollow chuckle. To think how I'd been taken in. My world of high, intense emotions collapsing around me released not only the mental strain, but the very high physical pressure under which I had been living. I felt I might explode. My only defence was I could not have expected it of Marion. Marion, who'd done so much for me. Marion, who knew how a boy felt. Marion, the virgin of the zodiac. How could she have sunk so low? To be what we all despised more than anything. Soft, soppy, hardly, when the joke grew staler, a subject for furtive giggling. My mind flew this way and that. Servants, silly servants who were in love and came down red-eyed to prayers. Postcards, picture postcards, comic postcards, vulgar postcards, found in shops on the front. I'd sent some of them myself before I knew better. He's talking about the thin, fat motif in postcards. The man or the woman grossly out of proportion, under or oversized. The man or the woman, the man or the woman. I laughed and laughed, half wishing Marcus had been with me to share the joke, and at the same time miserable about it, and obscurely aware that ridicule, however enjoyable, is no substitute for worship. That Marion of all people should have done this. No wonder she wanted it kept secret, instinctively, to cover her shame. I thrust the letter deep into the envelope and sealed it. Yes, it must be delivered. So there we have the beginning of the end, as Leo realizes that he still will deliver the letter. He still wants to find out about spooning. He goes and sees Ted. They have an argument, and it's the beginning of the end. And I'm now going to skip to the next belladonna moment, when, oh, now I'm just wondering which bit to read next, because there's so many exciting and brilliant books in this book. Oh, here we go. Here's the belladonna bit. And then I'm going to read you a little bit more. What I love about the book is the way the themes run through it in a very satisfactory way. And the belladonna is something that keeps coming back and haunting Leo until he decides that it's got to be the instrument of his curse that he wants to put on basically Ted and Marion, even though he actually loves Marion. Here he is, having spent a long time thinking about what kind of curse he's going to write and how he's going to do it. And he's gone out into the dark, into the night, to look for the belladonna. Though my eyes got gradually accustomed to the darkness, I was almost on top of the outhouses before I saw the thick blur of the deadly nightshade. It was like a lady standing in her doorway, looking out for someone. I was prepared to dread it, but not prepared for the tumult of emotions it aroused in me. In some way, it wanted me. I felt just as I wanted it, and the fancy took me that it wanted me as an ingredient and would have me. The spell was not waiting to be born in my bedroom, as I meant it should be, but here in this roofless shed, and I was not preparing it for the deadly nightshade, but the deadly nightshade was preparing it for me. Come in, it seemed to say, and at last, after an unfathomable time, I stretched my hand out into the thick darkness, where it grew, and felt the shoots and leaves close softly on it. I withdrew my hand and peered. There was no room for me inside, but if I went inside into the unhallowed darkness where it lurked, that springing mass of vegetable force, I should learn its secret and it would learn mine. And in I went. It was stifling yet delicious. The leaves, the shoots, even the twigs so yielding. And this must be a flower that brushed my eyelids, and this must be a berry that pressed against my lips. At that, I panicked and tried to force my way out, but could not find the way out. There seemed to be a wall on every side, and I barked my knuckles. At first, I was afraid of hurting the plant. Then, in my terror, I began to tear at it and heard its branches ripping and crackling. Soon I cleared a space round my head, but that was not enough. It must be all clear. The plant was much less strong than I supposed. I fought with it. I got hold of its main stem and snapped it off. There was a swish, a soft sighing fall of leaf on leaf, a swirl, a debris of upturned leaves, knee-deep all around me, and standing up among them the torn stem. I seized it and pulled it with all my might, and as I pulled, the words of the missing spell floated into my mind out of some history lesson. Delenda est belladonna! Delenda est belladonna! I heard the roots creaking and cracking, felt their last strength arrayed against me, the vital principle of the plant defending itself in its death agony. Delenda est belladonna, I chanted, not loudly, but loud enough for anyone listening to hear, and braced myself for a last pull. And then it gave, came away in my hands, throwing up with a soft sigh a little shower of earth, which rustled on the leaves like rain. And I was lying on my back in the open, still clutching the stump, staring up at its mop-like coronal of roots, from which grains of earth kept dropping on my face. That is a pretty intense scene where Leo is grappling with the terrifying belladonna. By the way, it's great to see lots of lovely people joining me. Hi, Nat. Hi, Anna. Hi, Sophia. Hi, ACMCD. Hi, Harper. Lovely to see you all this evening. And I really hope that you're all going to read The Go-Between. Maybe you've read it already. I bet some of you have. And I'd love to know how you feel about it if you have read it. And have you reread it? I first read it when I was about 13 because my mum was obsessed with H.E. Bates and she gave me all his books. And I do remember knowing that it was a bit too old for me and I didn't really understand it fully, but I also loved it and became absolutely entranced and gripped. And I do remember talking about it with my mum as well. And I then went on to read all of H.E. Bates's L.P. Hartley, not H.E. Bates. I always get those confused because of the shortenings. So I'm talking about L.P. Hartley, not H.E. Bates. So my mum was obsessed with L.P. Hartley and I became obsessed with him as well. So first read it when I was 13 and then went back and read it again in my 20s and began to understand what was going on, and then read it again in my 30s and 40s, and I'm now in my 50s reading it again and still loving it. It is such a great book, and it's one which repays returning to again and again, because each time you discover something exciting in it that you didn't know about before, and you see all the lovely richly woven ideas which L.P. Hartley, not H.E. Bates, manages to weave in to this gorgeous book. David, lovely to see you also. I wonder if it's a book that you and Estelle have read. I bet you have. And if you haven't, consider reading it aloud to each other, because it really is a fantastic read aloud book. So after Leo has the fight with the belladonna, I'm not going to give you all the spoilers, but anyone joining now who doesn't want spoilers, beware and turn the volume down if you don't want to hear what happens. And Harper, if you're watching right now, don't, because you've got to read the book before you know what happens. So Leo, you'll be glad to hear he doesn't use the belladonna as a poison. It's more of a metaphorical curse that he's making. But hideously, awfully, his curse does bear fruit. And there's this wonderfully awful scene, which is equally brilliant in the book and the film, where Leo is forced by Marian's mother to go and reveal where Marian is. Leo knows that Marian is with Ted at this point, and she has managed to persuade everyone else that she's been on some perfectly innocent expedition. I think she's told people that she's gone to get herself measured for a hat or something like that for her forthcoming wedding. And everyone else is playing cricket. She misses that. They start wondering where she is. And Marian's mother clearly knows that something terrible is afoot, and she insists that Leo must take her to find exactly where Marian is. And this is actually a pretty insane scene, because why would Marian's mother want to expose her in such a way? It is an utterly horrific scene, but absolutely brilliant too. And I'm going to read you that scene if I can now find it. Just give me 1 second. Here we go, I've got it. Where can she be? Asked someone, but not as if it mattered. Sorry, where can she be? Yes, where can she be? She's got to change. She might be changing now. She may be upstairs changing, Dennis said. Well, all we can do is wait for her, said Mr. Maudsley equably. That's her dad. Cap nodded at Cap sagely. Whistles began to blow, and a man who was starting to read a riddle, shouting to make himself heard, when all at once Mrs. Maudsley pushed her chair back and stood up. Her elbows were sticking out, her body was bent and trembling, and her face unrecognisable. No, she said, we won't wait. I'm going to look for her. Leo, you know where she is. You shall show me the way. Before I knew what was happening, she'd swept me from the room, as much by the authority of her voice and manner as by her hand, which I think touched my shoulder. Madeline, her husband's voice called after her. It was the only time I ever heard him call her by her name. As we passed through the hall, my eyes caught sight of the green bicycle, and in an instant it was photographed on my mind. It was propped against the newel post of the staircase and somehow reminded me of a little mountain sheep with curly horns, its head lowered in apology or defence. The handlebars turned towards me were dwarfed by the great height of the saddle, which pulled out to its fullest extent for Marian to ride, disclosed a shining tube of steel 6 inches long. That's a bit of a metaphor if ever I heard one. The vision remained with me, imparting a distressing sense of something misshapen and misused as I ran through the rain at Mrs. Maudsley's side. I did not know that she could run at all, but I could hardly keep up with her. She ran so fast. Her lilac paper bonnet was soon soaked through. It flapped dismally as she ran, then clung to her head, dark and transparent, while the water dripped off the strings. I felt the rain oozing through my dunce's cap, cooling my head and coursing down my back. I think that's a metaphorical dunce's cap, by the way. Actually, the rain was less heavy than it had been. The thunder was more distant, and the lightning, instead of darting ice blue from black clouds, wriggled slowly, an orange trickle down a primrose-coloured sky. I was too frightened to mind the storm, though it increased my wretchedness. What I was most aware of, outside my misery, was the indescribable smell of rain filling the air. Mrs. Maudsley said nothing, but ran with wide, awkward steps, her skirt with its 3 rows of braid dragging at the gravel and swishing through the puddles, and soon I realised that it was she who was guiding me. She knew where we were going. When we came to the cinder path between the rhododendrons, I tried to turn her back. I cried, "Not this way, Mrs. Maudsley!" But she paid no heed to me and plunged blindly on until we came to the outhouse, where the deadly nightshade had been. The tousle-headed stump was still lying on the path, limp and bedraggled. She stopped and peered inside at the leaves, wet, but already withering. "Not here," she said, "but here, perhaps, or here. You said there were poachers." Not a sound came from the forlorn row of huts, only the rain pattering on their battered roofs. I could not bear to aid her in her search and shrank back, crying, "No, you shall come," she said, and seized my hand, and it was then that we saw them together on the ground, the Virgin and the water carrier, 2 bodies moving like one. I think I was more mystified than horrified. It was Mrs. Maudsley's repeated screams that frightened me, and a shadow on the wall that opened and closed like an umbrella. I remember very little more, but somehow it got through to me, while I was still at Brandon Hall, that Ted Burgess had gone home and shot himself. Have you ever read a more devastating and shocking scene? It's so brilliant, and I do hope anyone here tonight has already read it at this point. because that was a bit of a spoiler, but I did give you warnings. So even when you know that ending is coming, the book is still absolutely brilliant, riveting, and impossible to put down. And there is an aftermath in which Leo returns to Norfolk to revisit this tragic scene. And he actually meets Marion as an old lady. And it actually reminds me a little bit of Tom's Midnight Garden. It's a slightly similar scene, which if people haven't read is also an amazing book, one of my favourites. It is a children's book. But Tom in that book goes back to visit an old lady, and it's very, very nostalgic for the past, just like this book is, because in this book at the very end, Leo is going back to see Marion, a woman that he was completely obsessed with and who he was instrumental in ruining her life. And she was more than instrumental in ruining his life. And what I also love about the book is Marion's absolute insensitivity to what she did to Leo. And I'm just going to read you a little bit about that because she is unbelievably emotionally blinded. When Leo goes back to visit her and he's in his 60s and he's essentially had an absolutely stunted life, stunted like the belladonna that he destroyed. And she has actually had a kind of rich and possibly happy life, having married, just to give full spoilers, everyone, if you're still here. I hope that you've already read the book. She does marry Lord Trimingham, who she was always meant to marry because, of course, Ted did shoot himself. She talks to him about those times, and she asks him one last favour. She asks Leo to go and visit her son who has completely rejected her because he is the son of Ted Burgess, not Lord Trimingham. So she says to Leo in her old age naivety, yes, Leo, you know the facts, you know what really happened. And besides me, only you know. You know that Ted and I were lovers. Well, we were. But we weren't ordinary lovers, not lovers in the vulgar sense, not in the way people make love today. Our love was a beautiful thing, wasn't it? I mean, we gave up everything for each other. We didn't have a thought except for each other. All those house parties, people being paired off like animals at stud, it wasn't like that with us. We were made for each other. Do you remember what that summer was like? How much more beautiful than any since? Well, what was the most beautiful thing in it? Wasn't it us and our feeling for each other? Didn't you realise it when you took our letters for us? Didn't you feel that all the rest, the house, the people coming and going, just didn't count? And wouldn't you feel proud to be descended from our union, the child of so much happiness and beauty? What could I say but yes? I'm glad you see it so, she said, for you were our instrument. We couldn't have carried on without you. Carried on. That sounds a funny phrase, but you know what I mean. You came out of the blue to make us happy, and we made you happy. Didn't we? You were only a little boy, and yet we trusted you with our great treasure. You might never have known what it was, have gone through life without knowing, and yet, Edward, she stopped. But you can tell him, Leo, tell him everything just as it was. Tell him that it was nothing to be ashamed of, and that I'm nothing to be ashamed of, his old grandmother whom people come miles to see. There was nothing mean or sordid in it, was there? And nothing that could possibly hurt anyone. And so on. It's brilliant. It's so tragic. And she is so deeply full of illusions. It's absolutely fantastically shocking and awful. And I just love that book. There is a glimmer of hope at the end of the book, which I will let you discover for yourselves. I hope you agree that The Go-Between is one of the greatest novels ever written. It's a brilliant one to read this very summer, 2021. We've just been having a heat wave, very much like the heat wave in this book. But now it's not so lovely outside. You can recreate your own heat wave within the book. And as I suggested, do try and read it aloud with someone, because it really is an absolute treat to read aloud. So thank you so much for joining me tonight. It's been really fun to share this amazingly brilliant book with you this evening. Next week, I will be having a break. I will be in the Lake District at Ullswater, reading lots of books, which I am very much looking forward to. And the week after that, I'm going to be doing a special live bibliotherapy session on Damien Barr's Literary Salon Facebook page about the subject of dogs in literature. And I'm hoping to do that session with Beetle the dog in my company, because she will have a lot to say about dogs in literature. So do join me for that. That's going to be, I think, the 14th of August, middle of August. And thanks so much for coming this evening. Have a lovely next couple of weeks and enjoy the go-between. Go out and get it now and read it with a friend or partner. See you soon. Good night.